and welcome to the University of St Andrews. I'd like to extend a warm greeting to all of our alumni, students, colleagues and friends watching from across the globe. My name is Craig Rutherford and I'm a development officer working here within the areas of arts and divinity at the university. If this is your first Saints talk, then thank you for joining us. These talks are short presentations by leading members of our academic community on subjects which we hope are of great interest. It's a little flavour of the expertise that our lucky current students get to see on a daily basis. This evening's talk will be given by Professor Sabine Hyland, and the talk will last for about 30 minutes, and then Professor Hyland will be happy to answer all of your questions. We'll aim to wrap the event up by 6:15 at the latest, so do please get your questions in early if you would like to ask anything. And if you'd like to ask a question, they can be added to the chat box just on the chat bar on your screen. Before we get into it, I'd just like to do a quick plug for the next talk in the series. We have a schedule of these talks extending right the way up to Christmas and then more planned for beyond. So the one after this will be on the Tuesday the 16th of November, and that is Ayuka de Murtal from our School of Mathematics. So that's 2 weeks today. I should also say that you can access the full archive of past talks on a plethora of subjects from bird migration to tackling coronavirus on our dedicated St Andrews Alumni YouTube channel, and this talk will also be archived there over the coming days. Before that though, let's get back to this evening's topic at hand and tonight's guest. Professor Sabine Hyland is an academic working within the School of Divinity here at St Andrews. Professor Hyland has spent much of her career working with others on how to solve the enigma of a mysterious form of writing with strings. For over 15 years, Sabine has collaborated with elders in remote Andean villages to discover new insights into how native Peruvians communicated through 3D coloured chords known as khipus. Her exciting research has uncovered isolated communities where khipus, which were previously thought to have been wiped out during the European invasion in the 1500s, are still being used within living memory. The Incas kept their accounts, histories and sacred knowledge on khipus. So if we could decipher these knotted chords, we could gain an insider's view into their extraordinary empire. Professor Hyland's research has been covered in a number of august publications and media outlets, such as Scientific American, National Geographic, the BBC, The Times and the Discovery Channel. The Leverhulme Trust, the USA's National Endowment for the Humanities and the National Science Foundation, as well as the John Simon Guggenheim Foundation, have supported her varied projects in South America. In 2015, the National Geographic Society selected her as a National Geographic Explorer in recognition of her great contributions to South American anthropology. So tonight, the subject of Professor Hyland's talk is Unravelling an Ancient Code Written in Strings. Sabine.
Okay, great. Thank you for that very nice introduction, and thank you to all of you in the audience for coming out tonight to hear me. In July of 2015, my husband Bill and I were crammed into a crowded minivan, climbing out of Lima's coastal mist into the sun-filled mountains thousands of feet above. After hours of dust clouds and hairpin turns, our destination appeared below, the remote village of San Juan de Collata in the Peruvian Andes. It's a scattering of adobe houses, which at the time had no running water, no sewage, and electricity only for a few homes. The several hundred inhabitants of this community speak a form of Spanish heavily influenced by their ancestral Quechua. Arriving at the village was like entering into another world, one that I've been fortunate to experience through my ethnographic research in the Andes. And here you can see where the village is in relationship to the map of Peru. Bill and I spent our first few hours in Collata making formal presentations to the village assembly, requesting permission to study the two rare and precious objects that the community has guarded for centuries, bunches of twisted and colored cords known as khipus. After dinner, the man in charge of the community treasure, a herder named Uber Brañez Mateo, brought over a colonial chest containing the khipus along with goat hide packets of 17th and 18th century manuscripts. This is the secret patrimony of the village. So the khipus were placed on top of the manuscripts. They've now been hidden in an even more remote part of the village. Okay. This chest was kept inside the colonial church in a secret underground chamber under the sacristy. Bill and I had the tremendous honor of being the first outsiders ever allowed to see these khipus. Over the next couple of days, we would learn that these multicolored cords, each khipu which was over about 2 feet long, were narrative epistles created by local chiefs during a time of warfare in the 18th century. But that first evening, exhausted yet elated, Bill and I simply marveled at the colors of the delicate animal fibers. Crimson, gold, indigo, green, cream, pink, and shades of brown from fawn to chocolate. In its heyday, oh, there you can see another picture with the colors of the cords. In the heyday of the Inca Empire, which lasted, I mean, the empire, of course, started earlier than 1400, but really its imperial period is considered to begin around 1400 until 1532 when the Spanish arrived and invaded. During the heyday of the Inca Empire, there would have been hundreds of thousands of khipus in use. One of the great mysteries about the Incas is that we still have only the most rudimentary understanding of their writing system. To keep all of their records, whether they're accounts of tribute given or their historical narratives, the Incas used systems of colored and knotted cords known as khipus. Numerous early Spanish chroniclers of the Incas describe the khipu and its uses. We know that they were employed to store economic, calendrical, and census data, along with histories and missives. Yet we know relatively little about these devices, in part because virtually all the khipus in the world today, almost all of them, are in museums and other collections with little or no provenance and no relationship whatsoever with the communities where they were made, and when we don't know where those communities were. Today, there are about 1,400 khipus in museums and private collections. Most, as I said, are thought to record numerical accounts. So this khipu, for example, we know encodes numbers in the knots. But we don't know what those numbers mean. According to Spanish chroniclers who saw khipus still being used, other khipus record narrative information, histories, biographies, and communications between administrators in different towns. Discovering a narrative khipu that can be deciphered has been one of the holy grails of South American anthropology. If we could find such an object, we might eventually be able to read how native South Americans viewed history and rituals in their own words, opening a window to a new Andean world of religion, literature, and the arts. Until recently, scholars believed that the khipu tradition had died out in the Andes soon after the Spanish invasion in 1532, lingering only in the simple cords made by herders to keep track of their flocks. And this is an example of a herding cord that was made in Bolivia in 1893. Yet in the 1990s, anthropologist Frank Solomon discovered that villagers in the community of San Andrés de Tupicocha, a small community in the same district as Coyata, and there you can see it on the map, had continued to make and interpret khipus into the early 20th century. And this is one of their khipus that is rolled up. Okay. Although the inhabitants can no longer read the cords, the fact that these khipus have been preserved in their original village context, which is incredibly rare, holds the promise of new insights. For the past 15 years, there you can see, this is in the village of Tupicocha. Each lineage within the village has its own patrimonial khipu. And they believe that these khipus once encoded perhaps the accounts of goods belonging to the khipu. It's not really to the community, the lineage known as an Ayu. When new lineage leaders are put into office once a year, as a mark of their office, they wear their khipus around their chests. And there's actually a lot, I think, of relationship between khipus and the human body, which I'm happy to explain in the question and answer period, if anyone's interested. I worked first in Mangas, in a village to the north of Coyata. Okay. And in this village, I studied a hybrid khipu alphabetic text that was created in the 19th century. while in another community called Anchucaya, this is the road to Anchucaya, there only horses and mules could get through, and llamas, I suppose. In Anchucaya, I was able to interview the grandson, named Don Mesias Pumahulca, of the last quipu expert in the village, and I was actually able to locate 3 quipus from that village in the National Archaeology Museum in Lima. In San Pedro de Casta, this is another village, again, this is close to Coyata, village authorities allowed me and my husband Bill to photograph their secret 62-page ritual manuscript known as the Antablo, written mainly in 1921, which describes their use of quipus in their most important annual ritual, the 8-day ceremony dedicated to the cleaning of irrigation canals, which honors the forces of fertility in the water, land, and mountains. The name of this manuscript, the Antablo, is a pun, and it refers to this is another hybrid quipu alphabetic text, which is also called an Antablo, and which used to be a part of the ceremony. As a community member told us, this manuscript known as the Antablo contains all the knowledge that a person could ever need in life, and villagers refer to it as their sacred Bible. Okay. My motivation for this quest is a simple one: to understand how Andean peoples have used these knotted and twisted cords to communicate and record knowledge, fulfilling the functions of writing, although traditionally quipus have not been considered as such. Scholars often speak of the Inca paradox. That is, if writing is seen as essential to civilization, as is generally argued, how could the Inca Empire, a state the size of the Western Roman Empire at its height, with a centralized socialist economy, considered a redistributive economy, for its over 14 million citizens, its monumental architecture, poetry, history, and complex religious hierarchy, how could it have existed without writing? It just doesn't make sense. Here you can see the Inca capital of Cusco, which is a major city in the 15th century. Okay. And my research is beginning to change how we view Inca quipus. And this is a beautiful, nice cover of a recent New Scientist magazine, which declared, "We thought they left no writing, we were wrong," very dramatically. Okay, no pressure there, right? Quipus certainly served in the place of writing in the pre-Columbian Andes, even if their formal characteristics, 3-dimensional tactile fibers, are radically different from any known writing system. My hope is that by deciphering how quipus encoded knowledge, I can not only expand our understanding of what writing is, but can also demonstrate the intellectual sophistication of the indigenous peoples of the Andes. The post-Inca quipus that I'm working on occur in the context of nations with alphabetic writing, but I believe that these quipus retain enough pre-Columbian features to help us decipher earlier Andean corded texts. So, for example, my research on Anchucaya's 20th century quipus allowed me to decipher the meaning of the 2 most common color patterns in quipus. A pattern where you have color banding, where you have bands of color going down, or seriation, where you have a sequence of colors over and over. Okay. I was able to come up with a decipherment. It's a little complicated to explain now. This has been one of the mysteries. 2 years ago, a Harvard doctoral student, John Clendaniel, was able to prove in his doctoral thesis that my discoveries about the meaning of these patterns actually holds true for Inca quipus. And this is a step forward in decipherment, and it also shows the continuity between Inca quipus and those that existed after the Inca period. Okay, well, back to Collada. I had been invited to Collada by a woman named Meche Orozco, who was the head of the Association of Collatinos in Lima. She was a nurse. She had been born in Collata, but left it when she was a teenager. She had seen a National Geographic documentary decoding the Incas about my research on quipus, and so she wanted to contact me. She wrote me on Facebook, actually, asking if I wished to visit her home village, where, she said, 2 khipus were preserved. Well, you can imagine I was very, very, very excited about that. And I was able to get some funding from National Geographic to support the trip. We actually negotiated for months with village authorities in Coyata itself to allow me access. And she would eventually host me and Bill at her home in Coyata. Meche met with the village assembly, and they voted to allow me into the village to study their khipus months before I arrived, and before Bill and I made our case in person to the village authorities. I found out later that after Meche made her case, and the community leaders agreed to allow me to study the khipus, that wild vicuñas appeared in the mountain slopes surrounding the village for the first time in decades. This was taken by the community as a sign that the mountain beings called apus had approved of my coming. Since my first visit, I've learned that the villagers believe that the khipus chose me to study them, not the other way around. The cords are believed to have their own kind of sentience and to be intimately related to the mountain beings and to the wild vicuñas. And for example, whenever they would be brought out to study, Meche would very surreptitiously go and make little offerings of coca leaf and of tobacco. She would just open up some cigarettes to the mountain spirits to help in my study of them and to thank them for allowing me to study them. From our first morning in Coyata, we had only 48 hours to photograph and take notes on the 2 Coyata khipus and the accompanying manuscripts, a daunting task given their complexity. Each khipu has over 200 pendant cords tied onto a top cord almost as long as my arm. The pendant cords, averaging a foot in length, are divided into irregular groupings by cloth ribbons tied onto the top cord. Like about a quarter of the khipus known today, these lack knots to represent numbers. It was soon clear that the Coyata khipus were unlike any of the hundreds of khipus that I had seen before. They had a much, much greater range of colors. I talked to Huber and his companion Javier, who had been assigned to watch me, to keep an eye on both of us as I studied the khipus. Huber explained that the pendants were made of the fibers from 6 different Andean animals: vicuña, deer, alpaca, llama, guanaco, and vizcacha. Vizcacha is a common rodent that's hunted for food. In many cases, and we went through each cord and he identified the fiber. In many cases, the fiber could only be identified by touch. So for example, now there's Huber and Javier. Okay. This cord in the middle is dark brown deer hair. And this cord is dark brown guanaco fiber. And they look very similar, but they actually have a completely different feel. Here's a picture of what a wild guanaco looks like. Okay. In fact, I was asked to not wear any gloves when I handled the khipus because that was considered disrespectful and I wouldn't be able to feel what the fibers felt like. Okay. They, along with the others, Huber and Javier, along with the others in the village, insisted that the difference in fiber was significant. Huber even called the khipus a language of animals. According to the elderly men in the village, the khipus were letters, epistles written by local leaders during their battles on behalf of the Inca in the 18th century. Until a few years ago, the khipus' existence was a closely guarded secret among the senior men, who passed the responsibility for the archive that included the documents and the khipu to younger men when the younger men reached maturity. The Coyata khipus, I was told, were, as I said, created as part of a native rebellion in 1783, centered in the village of Coyata and the neighboring village of Costa. Costa, of course, is where they have that Antablo manuscript that I was able to study. The Archive of the Indies in Seville houses over 1,000 pages of unpublished testimony from captured rebels who were interrogated in prison in 1783, and their words tell the story of this revolt. A man named Felipe Velasco Tupainca Yupanqui, a charismatic merchant who peddled religious paintings in the mountains, declared a revolt against the Spanish in 1783. Testimony from captured rebels recounts that Yupanqui ordered the men of Coyata and the neighboring villages to lay siege to the capital of Lima with the goal of placing himself on the throne of Peru. And this prisoner testimony of the rebels also describes how they had a secret writing system that they used to send letters back and forth. So that corresponds exactly to the oral tradition of the villagers today, and that this writing system was legible to men and women who were not able to read alphabetic writing. Okay, so that again fits the story of these chords. In January 1783, Yupanqui spent 2 weeks in Collada stirring up revolutionary fervor. He would dress in a lilac-colored silk frock cloak with purple lace. It must have been very striking. His attack on Lima in late May had barely begun when a group of his allies betrayed him and held him captive until the Spanish troops arrived. Despite a fierce ambush by rebels from Collada and Casta, the soldiers carried him and his associates to Lima, where he was tortured, tried, and executed. Well, how did the Collada Quipus encode their message? Right? That's the million-dollar question. According to a Spanish friar in the 16th century, who used quipus extensively in evangelization, narrative quipus in the colonial era encoded messages through, he said, pauses and syllables, that is, through encoding the sounds of syllables. The Collada quipus appear to be logosyllabic, meaning that they record their messages through a combination of phonetic and ideographic symbols. The pendants have over 95 different combinations of color, fiber type, and direction of ply. Direction of ply is whether they're twisted to the left or to the right. And again, we know from other types of information that this was very important in quipu symbolism. Okay. Okay. Logosyllabic writing systems typically have between 80 and several hundred different symbols in their systems. So the Collada quipus really fit into that pattern. Each quipu, each of the Collada quipus, with a couple of hundred pendants, might reasonably have held about 150 words. In fact, rebels in an earlier rebellion in the same province also used quipu communications. Although those quipu epistles have not survived, a Spanish translation of one of these earlier quipu letters does exist, and it's about 150 words long. So if that were also syllabic, it would have been about the same length as the Collada quipus. According to local tradition, the first quipu was created in the 18th century by the head of Collada's leading kin group, or it's called an ayu, called Ayuka. We have reason to believe that quipus encoded the identity of the sender of the information on the ending chords. If you hypothesize that the first quipu was signed at the end with the lineage name Ayuka, then the last three pendants should stand for the syllables A, U, Ka. Interestingly, the last pendant in the sequence is blue, and the local word for blue is Uncas. Perhaps the Ka comes from the color name. If we then apply these associations to the final chords of the second quipu, the pendants sound out Aka and an unknown word, which is a color called paru. It's the color of ripening maize in the local dialect. And that gives us Akaparu or Akapar. In fact, Akapar is the lineage of a man named Ciriaco Flores, who was the rebel Inca's right-hand man. In the prisoner testimony, I discovered that Ciriaco did send out quipu letters throughout June of 1772. And in these quipu letters, he explained that the Incas had returned and that if they joined his revolt, it would usher in a new era of liberty and native rule. And he would have signed those with his lineage name. It's also worth mentioning that this is one of the most standard ways of beginning to decipher any text in an unknown writing system. You first try to locate places in the text where particular or certain kinds of information would be held. So for example, Champignon's big breakthrough was when he realized that when he was looking at the Egyptian glyphs, that the pharaoh's name would be in the cartouches. In the decipherment of Mayan glyphs, a major breakthrough occurred when Tatiana Proskoryakov realized where the birth, accession, and death dates for Mayan rulers occurred within the writing on monumental stelae. So my work on deciphering these final chords of these two missives is very much in line with this kind of decipherment. And again, it also fits with what we know about how narrative colonial khipus encoded information. Other signs seem to represent entire words or ideas. For example, villagers told me that this brush of bright red deer hair at the beginning of one of the khipus indicates that the khipu is about warfare on behalf of the Inca king. The prisoner's testimony reveals that this khipu, with this gorgeous red deer hair Kaitei, the beginning bundle on a khipu is called a Kaitei, would have been created first in early June of 1772, and this is the one that is signed, if you will, with the lineage name Yacapar from Ciriaco Flores. It appears, and again, this is our hypothesis based on the structure of the khipu and on what we know from the prisoner's testimony, that this second khipu may have been created in January of 1773, when Felipe Yubanqui spent 2 weeks in Coyata. During that time, the native mayor of Coyata, a man named Antonio Pascual from the Ayuka lineage, created khipu epistles that he sent to the leaders of nearby villages, telling them to come to see the Inca, to give him homage, and to join the revolution. Andeans typically make copies of important khipus, and this appears to be such a copy hidden for centuries. The Coyata khipus are the first authentic khipus ever shown to be logosyllabic. And this is the first discovery of a unique, previously unknown form of logosyllabic writing, one that communicates sounds through three-dimensional animal fiber cords that must be felt as well as seen. This raises, of course, a lot of questions, and most of which I cannot answer. I'll give you fair warning right away. Were these logosyllabic khipus a local phenomenon influenced by contact with Spanish writing? They might have been. Or do they have far-reaching roots into the pre-Columbian Andean past? Do other types of khipus that were used in the Central Andes until the 20th century, such as those used for accounting, share features with the phonetic khipus? What are the epistemological implications of a three-dimensional writing system in which the sense of touch plays as important a role as sight? And how does this expand our idea of what writing is? In other words, if your idea of how you get information is through reading, visual information is always at a distance. But if the very way in which you understand information, in which you read, so to speak, is through touch, do you understand that information a different way because touch is something where you're bringing something into one's own body? I believe that Andean ideas of knowledge are such that for knowledge to be considered very, very deep and profound and real, it has to be multisensorial. And I think that's one reason why khipus have continued up until the present day. Anyway, I'll be trying to answer these questions as I continue my research on these and other khipus in the area, finding out about other villages like this community of Tiklios, where a version of the khipu tradition continues. Tiklios is in the Central Andes. It's close to the village of Mangas, which has the khipu board. And in Tiklios, they make funerary khipus. Now, these funerary khipus are much simpler than Inca khipus. They're much simpler than the phonetic khipus of Coyata. The knots on the funerary khipus encode prayers, and they're wrapped around the waist of a corpse when it's buried. And it's believed that the khipu will guide the individual through all the dangers and hazards of the afterlife. This gentleman, Kaitei Ilario, is a contemporary maker of funerary khipus, and it's an art that he learned from his great-grandparents. And he says that the act of making the khipus, which is actually a communal act, because all of the relatives have to bring the thread that the khipu is made from, the relatives of the deceased, and they actually work together to make the khipu. He said that making the khipu actually helps to control one's grief. Okay. Studying post-Inca khipus, like those of Collada or those of Tiklios, where we can speak to the descendants of the khipu creators or to the creators themselves, provides essential clues for unraveling this ancient form of string communication. What I suspect is that the Central Andes had a regional tradition of phoneticism in khipus, and it remains to be seen whether this tradition of phoneticism had any role to play in narrative Inca khipus or not. You may be interested to know that in St. Andrew's own newly opened Wardlaw Museum, which is a wonderful free museum on the Scores, the museum boasts a brand new khipu exhibit with an Inca-era khipu from a region in the northern Inca Empire known as Chimu. The Chimu were famed for their silver working techniques, and there's a Chimu-era silver beaker on display next to the khipu. This Inca-era khipu on display in the Wardlaw Museum is the only khipu in a modern public display in the whole United Kingdom. As we learn more about Andean khipus, we can appreciate the richness and the sophistication of this unique form of communication. Post-Inca khipus, which often can be studied in conjunction with the words of their creators, present us with the opportunity to advance inquiries into the nature of corded texts, illuminating facets of how this three-dimensional writing system may have functioned throughout its millennium of use. Thank you very much.
It's genuinely thrilling for us to go on that journey with you, for those of us that have been starved of travel for the last couple of years. It's great to see the lengths that academics like yourself will go to as well to unravel a mystery for the benefit of research and for all of us. We've had some questions coming from our viewers, and I'll get onto them in a bit, but first I was just going to ask a question of my own, if that's all right. I'd just remind you, if you want to ask a question, please just do put it into the chat bar, and we will we'll sift through them and we'll ask them as we come to them. But yeah, if I could just ask firstly myself, speaking about travel, obviously this is an area where it's really important for you to go and see the objects and touch the objects and study them in situ and speak to the people that hold them and have that collective memory. How has the lack of being able to travel affected your work, and have you been able to carry on with your various contacts in South America? And do you see a time when you might be able to get back there?
Well, I'm supposed to be back in Peru, certainly in May, back to Collada to film a documentary with a French documentary crew. Yeah, it's been very problematic. I had to cancel quite a number of trips into the Central Andes. However, I have to say that with the support of the University of St. Andrews, I was able to carry out remote research on funerary khipus starting in January of this year. I had a friend, a man named Roberto Aldave Palacios, and he's the one who took the picture of Kaitei Hilario. Kaitei, by the way, means father, and it's a term of respect. Because I wasn't able to go to Peru, I worked with Roberto, who's a businessman and a local tour leader, and who's from the Central Andes. And so he had familial contacts all through that area. And it had been thought that the last maker of funerary khipus died. Her name was Mama Licuna. She died in 2014, and people thought that the tradition was gone. We found, well, really, Roberto and his team, his niece and nephew, were able to find that because of the trauma of the COVID pandemic, I think, and you may know that Peru has had the highest per capita death rate from COVID of any country in the world. These khipu makers are back in business, and so, you know, it's not as good as being there. I would make lists of questions, and then Roberto's niece and nephew would make contact with the villages. The villages in the Central Andes were very closed off. They would make contact. They would have to take tests to show that they didn't have COVID. They had to wear masks. The General Assembly of the community had to take a vote to allow whether or not the khipu expert could be interviewed. Once they took that vote, once the approvals were made, then they had to do what's called a despacho, offering ceremonies to the various earth beings and the water beings and so on, and only then could they conduct the interview. So it's kind of incredible what this team went through to do this, and I'm so grateful. But of course, it isn't the same as being asked the questions oneself. And a lot of times when you're doing field work, it's those kind of off the cuff moments when somebody starts talking about something where you really get a lot of insights. But all the same, I'm very grateful both to my team in Peru and to the University of St. Andrews for supporting this remote research.
That's great, and it really kind of shows the importance of research networks that we're always keen to propagate here. And of course with our alumni as well, there's always great stuff that alumni can do for our networks. I was going to ask a little bit about what you touched on there about the kind of negotiation with the local Andean people to gain access to the keepers. How did you prepare for that, and kind of how intense were the appeals and the negotiations to get access? And further to that, are there, what do the keepers of the khipus gain from your studies? You said they had a vote to allow you in, and what is it that they see they're gaining from it? And also, finally, are there more out there that you know of that have not been studied? And is there a holy grail out there that's going to be the answer to all of this?
Well, I'll answer your last question last. I'm absolutely convinced that there are more out there, but to be honest, I'm not sure I would say where they are because I want to study them, and I'll get back and tell you if they're the holy grail or not. But yeah, I'm absolutely convinced there are more khipus out there to be studied. What do the individuals get out of this? I can tell you that in Koyata, well, first of all, the villagers in Koyata are concerned that their patrimony is dying, especially the older people are very concerned that their customs are disappearing as young people move to the capital of Lima. They're also concerned that and now I'm not saying whether this is true or not, but I'm saying this is the concern in the village. They're concerned that the Peruvian government is going to sell their lands to Chinese investors, and especially mineral investors. And so they wanted me there to write a report that would talk about the importance of their cultural patrimony, that they felt that they could use this in various legal occasions. And then finally, because these khipus turned out to be so exciting, I was approached, I publicized this through the normal channels, and then I was approached by the Peruvian Ministry of Education, and I volunteered my efforts, and I made actually a class on these Koyata khipus that was available to teachers all throughout the entire nation. And we were actually able to track that this reached over 500,000 students. And when Bill and I went back to Koyata, we had to present to the assembly again, permission to see the khipus again. And the village school teacher spoke up and she said, she said, when we have these little kids come to school, they hate being in school. They don't want to be there. And when I can show them that there is a lesson plan about their village, that people from the whole nation are learning, they get so excited about being in school. So, and Peru is a country where people have a great deal of pride in their pre-Columbian heritage. So be able to bring out new facets of that is always exciting. Now, how to negotiate with villages. Well, that's what makes being an anthropologist difficult. I'm fortunate. I was first lived in Peru when I was 16. My father was a professor of agricultural engineering at Cornell, and he was on sabbatical there. And when he would go into the countryside to speak to farmers, I would always tag along because I just loved it. And so I would watch my father and how he operated. You do your best. You try to learn to be respectful. You learn to conduct yourself well, and sometimes it doesn't work. So, for example, in the community of Anchucaya, where I spoke with Don Macias, the grandson of the last khipu expert in the village, the rumor spread that I was not really an anthropologist. I was actually an American Baptist missionary, and this was a very Catholic town, and they did not like Protestant missionaries there. And there was one Protestant well, there were two Protestant families. One of them, and people stopped selling me any food, right? They wouldn't sell me any food. I'd had nothing to eat. It was great for my I guess it's a way to diet, but this one woman who was Protestant, she knew what was going on. Every night she brought me a little jar of milk from her cow that she milked that morning. And so I'm still in the village one day, and I'm kind of wandering around, and this gentleman comes up to me and he says, "Hey, do you want to go read the Bible together?" So I'm like, sure, why not? You know, maybe there'll be food. And it turned out he was the other evangelical in the village. This was Don Macias, the grandson. And as we got talking, so that was wonderful. But the minute I got my interview from him, I have to confess, I left the village because that was not one of my more successful negotiations. But yeah, it's hard. It's very difficult. And in Collada, you know, Collada is one of those communities that they're able to keep their traditions because they're very closed off to foreigners. So for example, after the news stories came out about the Collada Quipu, I know a newspaper reporter from Lima tried to go there and she was threatened with her life. And that's why the Quipus are now even more hidden. So, wow. And we were threatened too. So
yeah, so it's real kind of intrepid stuff that you're doing there.
Oh yeah, well that's
they say
that anthropologists are adrenaline junkies, right?
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah. I've got an anonymous question that's come in. I know you've spoken about family lineage being represented in the keepers. Could you explain a bit more about how the keepers represent kind of these family lineages?
I think there are a lot of ways. First of all, I think quipus have a lot of variation. We know that quipus have lasted for over 1,000 years, right? The earliest quipus that nobody questions whether or not are quipus are from the Warri Empire. That's an empire before the Incas. And so they date to around 800-900 AD. And then quipus are used, you know, for economic information, certainly up until the 1940s, 1950s. So there's a lot of variation. I think there are a lot of different ways in which lineage, it's called an Ayu, lineage affiliation would have been represented on quipus. And various authors have, for reasons I don't want to get into now, speculated that these might have been indicated either in the ending chords of the quipus or in sometimes quipus have kind of an ornamented knot at the beginning that in some cases this might indicate the lineage. Or there might be aspects of the main chord that runs horizontally from which the pen is, that might indicate lineage. In the case of these logosyllabic chords, the lineage, I believe, was indicated through the syllables of the sound. But again, I think this is something that there's a lot of variation in.
We've had a really interesting question in from Ben, who has said that it looks relatively possible to add information to keepers, so it's something that you could continue adding to, but it looks like it might be difficult to edit previous information. So, you know, that affects how they can be used for kind of ledgers or audit trails or anything. Is there any evidence of editing keepers?
That's a very perceptive question. There are quipus that are found that are unknotted. We know that in some of the modern communities that used quipus like Anchucaya, at the end of the year, every lineage would bring its quipu, and the quipus kept track of everyone's contributions of labor and goods to communal projects. And then people would sit there for like, you know, all day long as it took, multiple days, and they would work out all the accounts to make sure everybody gave what they were supposed to give. And the quipus are not calculating devices. For calculations, they would use grains of maize on the ground or little stones to make the calculations. At the end, when all the accounts were settled, the knots were undone. And the metaphor that was used is that the cords then became clean, and they're clean for the new year when they would be knotted all over again. There is evidence in what are alleged to be Inca khipus of this kind of unknotting as well. So you can see it's not so easy to see in cotton khipus, but in animal fiber khipus, kind of the kinks remain from where khipus were knotted.
So you can kind of read the unknotted knots or see that they were there anyway.
One would hope.
Yeah. Rose has put in a question that's similar to what I was wondering about the new funerary ones, and the other kind of post-Inca ones that we know of. Could you say a little bit more about them, and can the way that they are encoded now, that people are creating them, could they be used to help kind of decipher or translate older ones, or are they completely separate ceremonial entities?
That's a good question, and I don't know the answer to that yet. I'm working with a third-year undergraduate student in divinity to study the funerary khipus that I've been able to collect really since March and April of this year. But they're much simpler in a way. They're single cords and they have knots in them. When experts like Mama Licuna were asked about the meaning of the knots, she would say, oh, well, these mean either Hail Marys or Our Father prayers. But Roberto had unpublished footage of Mama Licuna making the khipus, and I was shocked that she actually associates each knot with a word in Quechua, making a poem about the movement of the dead person into the world of the ancestors and how they were going underneath the ground. So this kind of astounded me. I believe that khipus encoded a lot of wordplay and puns. I think that they used rebus, and rebus is a kind of pun. And Kaitei Hilario, when he talks about the meanings of the knots on the funerary khipus, he would get very poetic and he would use a lot of puns, and I think there's a lot more there. But again, you know, we were limited in how we were able to do our research. But I'm very hopeful that there's more there.
Great, thanks.
I want to say one more thing though. You know, there's so much of an emphasis in all of khipu studies and thinking them as writing or as like ledger accounts. And we think of those as very kind of utilitarian things. One of the things that's exciting to me is that in looking at post-Inca khipus, we realize how, yes, this is writing, but it's a concept of writing that's very different from what we know. And it has a lot of spiritual and you could almost call metaphysical significance too. That's important to think about.
Yeah, that leads on to some of the other questions we've had about, I know you mentioned this a bit in your talk about the relationship between khipus and the body, and you mentioned that they were worn at times. Could you say a bit more about how you think they view this relationship between khipus and the physical human?
Yeah, that's a great question, and I want to write an article out. So the measurements of a khipu are made according to the human body. So for example, the spacing of the knots is often in regards to the hand. The length of the main cord or the primary cord has to do with how far you outstretch your arms. Khipus were very public documents. Okay, they were usually read communally because they were going over accounts or so on, and so they were held out in people's arms. We know from a colonial account that in some regions, people wore their khipus wrapped around their heads. In other cases, as you saw, where people had them around their chest, while many khipus come from burials, in almost all cases, it was by looters. So there's only 2 cases where we actually have an individual that's associated with the khipu. And in one case, it's a little 3-month-old boy who was buried with the khipu nestled in his chest. And of course, the funerary khipus are wrapped around the waist and they go down the legs, and they're believed to give power and strength to the leg. You also have khipus that have human figures tied onto them. There's a community called Rapaz, which is a little to the north of the villages where I've talked about it in the talk tonight, where the khipu is incredible. It's still very much used within the community ceremonies. ritual specialists in charge of the khipus say that they're calendars, and they have little like doll-like figurines tied to them. There are other khipus that incorporate human hair. So yeah, there's a lot going on there between how khipus are really, you know, incorporated with the human body.
Thanks. You mentioned that there's 1,400 or so keepers in museums worldwide, but quite often the provenance is not very well recorded. Does that then hinder, presumably there's a development in keepers from the start of the Inca Empire as it goes through, they'll develop and become more complex, I suppose. Is there any sort of hints in the ones that we have to study of any kind of development, or even a kind of precursory system, or where they actually developed from? Or are they all kind of jumbled together with no dates and you can't tell what comes first and how they've changed?
Well, that's a great question. In the most general terms, we can talk about development. The Warri Empire, which existed prior to the Inca Empire, as I said, it you know, ended around 900 AD. The Warri khipus are very distinctive, and they're different in many ways from Inca khipus. By the late 20th century, there developed this notion of what an Inca khipu was. I think that in the Inca Empire, there was probably a fair amount of variation in khipu types, local variation. And then we do see a lot more variation in later khipus, but honestly, there's the khipu database that is now at the University of Chicago. It's called the Open Khipu Repository, and it's online. And that has data, I believe, in about 600 khipus. And when that was made, the person who made it believed that khipus stopped in 1532, by and large, and assumed that kind of every khipu in the museum that had a certain shape was from the Inca period. When we've been able to radiocarbon date small samples, for example, like a group of like 10 khipus in a museum, we find that at least a third of them date to the colonial period. Now, I don't know if that's, you know, nobody knows if that's true of all, you know, all the khipus in museums around the world yet. We just don't know. Part of the thing is you can do radiocarbon dating, but also just doing the archival research. In many cases, some of my students, like this one woman, Lucrezia Melillo, has been able to determine where some khipus in Italian museums came from by doing the archival research about it.
Thank you. And kind of moving on, sort of coming on from the ones that were in the colonial period, you mentioned one that was sent out as a letter about a rebellion, and it made me wonder, you know, I know these are incredibly complex and used for lots of different things, but you know, if you were to send out a letter in the form of a khipu, to me they look incredibly hard to decipher, but how quickly could someone actually read that? You know, is it like you or I reading a letter, or do we even know how that would have worked? I
think that they would read it much faster than we would think. I think that it wouldn't be like you know, just kind of automatic, but I think people would just go through and finger the chords and slowly sound out all the words. Yeah. And it's interesting, we have, you know, when I was working with these herders in Collada, they were able to distinguish the feel of the different animals. And a friend of mine, Jeffrey Splitstozer, who's a great Warri khipu expert, he made a khipu inspired by the Collada khipu of different animal fibers. It's very hard for us to be able to feel the difference that these herders can feel, you know, right away. And we're kind of drawing towards the end, but I'm going to ask you, I've got one final question. A lot of things nowadays are the power of kind of artificial intelligence is being put towards all sorts of problems and puzzles that we encounter in the modern world. I just wondered if you thought or knew of any research that is happening with khipus and AI, and whether you think that would be a fruitful research avenue to go down. Yeah, that's a great question. In fact, I've been in contact with an international tech company who's offered me the use of their AI specialists and there are computational linguists to see if we can decipher the Coyote khipus. So yeah, I'm very hopeful and excited, and who knows what the future will hold.
That's great. Okay, well, thank you very much. That's all we've really got time for this evening. That was really fascinating, and it's great to go on such a brilliant journey from the comfort of our own homes. So it falls to me just to thank Sabine again profusely for taking the time to talk to us on this subject, which she's clearly both very passionate about and undoubtedly world leading. It's been thoroughly interesting to explore a topic which I'm sure many of us know very little about. So thanks again to Professor Hyland for giving us some of her time. It's really much appreciated. Thanks also to all the staff who've given their time to make arrangements for this event. There's a lot of work goes into these, and it's much appreciated. Finally, a big thank you to you, our esteemed alumni and students and staff and friends, for attending this talk. We're delighted to be able to welcome you virtually back to St Andrews every few weeks, so please do continue to attend in the great numbers that you have been doing so. As I said at the start, our next talk is on the 16th of November, and that will be Professor Ayuka de Murtel from our School of Mathematics. But for now, we look forward to seeing you then, but thanks very much for coming, and enjoy the rest of your evening.